Hello and welcome. My name is Jane Buchanan, and I am the Director of Global Impact at HelpAge USA. I'm so glad that you could join our webinar today, where we're going to be sharing information about the work and impact of age inclusion specialists working in a number of humanitarian emergencies around the world to advance the rights and inclusion of older people. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the HelpAge USA website later today and circulated on social media. We have live interpretation, simultaneous interpretation into both English and Spanish. You can find the button for the interpretation on the bottom right of your screen. It looks like a globe, and underneath it reads interpretation. If you would like to use captions for this webinar, you can use the CC button that says Show Captions. After we hear from our amazing panelists, we will have time for question and answer, and we welcome all your questions. You may put them in the Q&A box in the middle of the bottom of your screen. Before we begin, we would also like to thank the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for their support in the work we're going to discuss today. And now to begin, I'll say just a few words about the organizations hosting this webinar. HelpAge USA is a US-based nonprofit organization that works as part of a global network of 200 organizations in 90 countries to advance the rights of older people. The global network includes HelpAge International, which both implements humanitarian response programming in partnership with local and national civil society actors, and also provides technical assistance on inclusion of older people. The reason that inclusion in humanitarian response is a priority for our organizations is because among those most at risk in conflicts, humanitarian crises, and climate-related disasters are older people, although they frequently remain invisible in response and protection. Rapid global population aging makes these concerns ever more pressing. Between 2015 and 2050, the proportion of the world's population over 60 will nearly double from 12% to 22%. 80% of people over 65 will live in low and middle income countries. There are a number of reasons why older people may be more exposed to harm during crises. They often remain in areas of active conflict or disaster, while other people flee to safety. Contrary to common assumptions, older people are not always taken care of by their families. Disability and lack of accessible evacuations or adequate shelter and other conditions and displacement can compel older residents to remain in unsafe areas, even if they would wish to flee. Others may choose to stay due to limited financial means, commitment to protect and preserve the family home, or to care for other older people or grandchildren. HelpAge research in multiple countries has found that very often humanitarian assistance does not consistently reach older people or respond to their specific needs. With regard to food, for example, centralized distribution points can be inaccessible because of their location or because they require waiting in long queues or jostling with other recipients to access limited supplies. Little attention is given to older people's particular nutritional requirements, despite their risk of malnutrition. And that's just one example. So as we begin our webinar, I'd like to introduce each of the speakers you're going to hear from today. First, you'll hear from Sam Wood, the Global Head of Humanitarian for HelpAge International, a role he has had for 5 years after many years of humanitarian work with Save the Children and other organizations around the world. After Sam, we'll hear from 2 researchers responsible for extensive research and a report evaluating the work of age inclusion specialists in 4 countries. They'll share their findings and recommendations. They are Dr. Alex Robinson, the Head of Disability Inclusion and Rehabilitation at the Nossal Institute for Global Health at the University of Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, whose research focus is on disability, development, and disaster risk. Also from the Nossel Institute is Dr. Rachel Coughlin. She's a senior technical advisor where her research focuses on health and social care, aging, disability, rehabilitation, palliative care, and humanitarian health practice. Next, you'll hear about the professional experience of one age inclusion specialist, Lemlem Abraham, working in Ethiopia, where she'll talk about the challenges and successes of her work. And finally, we'll hear from Kasia Kotmayeska, the Senior Protection Cluster Coordinator for UNHCR in Ukraine, who brings a perspective of the UN humanitarian system and what the specialist working in Ukraine has contributed to the protection of older people in that country. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Sam, and I'll also be sharing a slideshow.
Thanks so much, Jane, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar, which really does mark an important event. It's the launch of this really important piece of research, which looks at how we are seeking with our partners to influence the humanitarian system to make it more age inclusive. And I think, Jane beautifully described the wider context around the rapidly aging global population. And I think just one small reflection is, as we have got ever increasing challenges we're facing in the world with climate change, increased amounts of irregular migration, conflict, internal displacement, increasing numbers of refugees, ensuring that the capacities of older people are enabled in order to address many of these challenges is going to be one of the key issues for us globally in the future. So it's not just about the highlighting the needs, but also ensuring real meaningful participation of older people within the humanitarian system. And just one small example, but something that we see in our across surveys that we do in most emergencies is the role that older people play as primary caregivers of children so frequently. And when they're overlooked, systemically marginalized and discriminated against, then they can't perform these roles. So we're missing such an enormous trick there in terms of participation. But I'd like to also make a little bit of a comparison where the status of where we're at, where I think we're at anyway, with our movement to champion age inclusion globally. And the best comparison I can think of is we're where the child rights movement was probably in about the 1920s, just before there was a UN Convention on Rights for the Children. And a wonderful thing that's happened recently is the UN Human Rights Council has established intergovernmental working group, and they're tasked with drafting a UN Convention on the Rights for Older People, which is going to be a major step forward for us at sort of global policy level, and that's one of the key things that's happening at global level. But if we could go to the next slide, please, Alex. But we work at obviously in order to achieve what we want to achieve, which essentially is to change the way that older people are perceived and treated across the world. Obviously, our focus is in humanitarian situations. We work with our network of 200 organizations, but of course, we can't do that alone. We need to influence the actions of others, and we need to do that at all levels. So, of course, we've got the government level, but a big focus for us, and you'll see on the slide here, is localization. And we really, it's really central to HelpAge that we support a network of grassroots local organizations who are really there on the front line and really understand the needs and capacities of older people in the best way. And really what what the work of the age inclusion specialists, um, one key area of that is how they link the local to the global, in that we have local organizations who will speak to the age inclusion specialists, and I'll talk a little bit about more about them and where they're situated in a moment. And then that can be also linked to the global level as well. Um, but yeah, just to give you a quick tour of some of the other things that the HelpAge network does. So we provide life-saving assistance, and we can see here in across multiple sectors: food, cash, hygiene kits, mental health, and a lot of all of these activities, as much as possible, are tailored to include older people in the design and implementation. And home-based care is one of the major areas of work that our network um, does. Investing in research and evidence generation is absolutely key to shine a light on the issues faced by older people, and how they're excluded and what happens when we do include them, and shining a light on the benefits of that. I've also talked a little bit about the UN Convention, which we're very excited about, drafting the Convention on Rights for Older People. But also we've worked with partners to develop the humanitarian inclusion standards, which are global standards that support the humanitarian sector, including older people, and then also working with the UN system. I'll, I'll skip to the, yeah, if we go to the next slide. So I think one of the most impactful initiatives that we've had has been the creation of this work stream, essentially, of age inclusion specialists, and they're seconded into the humanitarian coordination structure at country level. Now, the piece of research looks at four particular countries: Ukraine, Moldova, Ethiopia, Venezuela. Um, and the role of these age inclusion specialists really is to work across all of the coordination of humanitarian aid within those specific countries, and to influence them to be more age inclusive. So providing training, technical advice, working with government ministries, advocating at the policy level, mapping ongoing humanitarian activities, and advising on how those can be more age inclusive. And there's a big focus also on data collection. That's a huge focus that we have, ensuring that sex, age, disability disaggregated data is collected, so that the needs and capacities of older people can be fed into the design of humanitarian interventions. And of course, we're talking about evidence generation research as well at multiple levels. But I think I've gone over my time a little bit, and it'll be much more interesting to hear from our researchers and also our age inclusion specialists. So I will hand you over to hear some of their exciting findings. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that overview and giving us the background into the age inclusion specialists, which we believe are going to have a really crucial, are having and will have a crucial impact on the humanitarian system. And now to hear about some research findings pointing to some of those conclusions, we're going to hear from our colleagues at the Nossel Institute, Alex and Rachel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. On behalf of Rachel and myself, we're really pleased to be able to present this research on the age inclusion specialists and promoting and strengthening older age inclusion in humanitarian action. Older people continue to be excluded and marginalized in responses to disasters and conflicts, and this is despite the recognition that exclusion and isolation during humanitarian response places older people at increased risk. And these risks include negative impacts on physical and mental health and increased exposure to malnutrition, injury, and disability. Whether direct or indirect, the exclusion of older people denies universal human rights and contradicts the principle of impartiality that aid should be provided on the basis of need alone. HelpAge is one of the few international organisations working directly to improve the inclusion of older people in humanitarian action. And as part of this work, HelpAge is deploying age inclusion specialists to humanitarian settings. Age inclusion specialists engage with the UN-led coordination mechanism to ensure older people are included and accounted for throughout the humanitarian response. The age inclusion specialists work directly with the protection cluster or, where present, via the Age and Disability Technical Working Group. However, their objectives extend to promoting older age inclusion more widely throughout the humanitarian response mechanism.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everyone. So the independent evaluation that our team conducted sought to answer this key research question. To what extent is the deployment of age inclusion specialists an effective strategy for promoting and increasing older age inclusion in humanitarian action? And so today, Alex and I will present just a really brief summary of the study findings. It's important to note that the research was not an assessment of individual age inclusion specialists, and it also did not extend to assessing the direct impacts on older people who are affected by a particular emergency or crisis, but really focused on understanding the effectiveness of age inclusion specialists as an intervention measure. So as Sam has already mentioned, we explored HelpAge's deployment of the age inclusion specialists across these 4 diverse humanitarian settings, so Ethiopia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Venezuela. And we did that through a desk review and through semi-structured interviews. We did a first round of interviews conducted remotely between October 2023 and January 2024, and then a second follow-up round of interviews in country between October 2024 and December 2024. And we interviewed 73 respondents, and 17 of those were interviewed in both the first and the second rounds.
Thanks, Rachel. So we identified 8 key findings and 8 aligning recommendations. These research findings reflect the perspectives of humanitarian actors on the impacts the age inclusion specialists are having on promoting the inclusion of older people in humanitarian action, enabling and constraining factors for success, and future directions to build on and sustain positive influence. Prior to the deployment of the age inclusion specialist, older people and older age inclusion were not regularly addressed or prioritised in protection cluster or other cluster meetings. However, following deployment of the age inclusion specialist, new and/or increased recognition of older age inclusion was reported alongside greater awareness of the risks that older people face. This was attributed to the age inclusion specialist being vocal in meetings and forums and ensuring older age was visible. And respondents strongly felt that the position is needed, and if there was no age inclusion specialist, there would be no or very limited visibility of older age. So we'll also be sharing some quotes as we go. The value of the age inclusion specialist position has been instrumental. Having a person who is dedicated to lead this conversation is needed. Because I'm not an expert on age and disability inclusion, I think the position is necessary. And our first recommendation is that mechanisms to facilitate the rapid deployment of age inclusion specialists in future humanitarian responses should be explored. Subsequent changes were incremental and ongoing. This included maintaining visibility and awareness of the importance of older age inclusion and providing technical support on the integration of older people in humanitarian and refugee response plans, guidelines, and sector-specific activities. Respondents reported an increase in demand over time for the technical inputs of and representation by the age inclusion specialists. This included an increase in the number of invitations to meetings, trainings, presentations and workshops delivered to cluster members and agencies by the age inclusion specialists. This also extended to high-level engagement within the humanitarian coordination mechanism. So our second recommendation is that there should be ongoing resource allocation to maintain the deployment of age inclusion specialists in existing and future humanitarian responses.
So then our third key finding, our respondents who were all humanitarian actors identified some characteristics that enabled the age inclusion specialists to effectively promote older age inclusion. So they noted firstly that age inclusion specialists or the position requires a range of soft skills. For example, building and nurturing relationships and networking and being able to bring humanitarian actors along the journey towards older age inclusion. And that path or that journey was recognised as sometimes being slow and sometimes quite arduous and hard work. And so respondents emphasised the need for patience, an ability to read the room and provide timely, appropriate and compelling inputs and messaging to humanitarian colleagues. They also identified the age inclusion specialists' need for specific technical skills on older age inclusion and the ability to be able to provide humanitarian colleagues with very specific practical and actionable advice and guidance. So this quote is an example of some soft skills that were identified. I don't see HelpAge or the age inclusion specialist, in my view, pushing dogmatically. Understanding the situation, my impression is the age inclusion specialist is a pretty practical person, which helps overall. And then an example of technical guidance and practical support, this one from Venezuela. Family separation was always considered only a child protection risk, and it's not, because it also affects people with disability and most of all the elderly and elderly women who find themselves as 80 and a grandma needing to change diapers and take care of children. With the protection monitoring, we were able to include this data, to include the elderly as key informants, which is giving us a new view. And so our third recommendation is that core competencies for age inclusion specialists should be established to facilitate recruitment and support ongoing professional development. And respondents then noted the contribution of relational, organisational and institutional systems of support, many of which were beyond the direct control or immediate expertise of the age inclusion specialists themselves. So things like access to HelpAge colleagues in other countries, which provided spaces and opportunities for sharing ideas and strategies and support. The positioning of the age inclusion specialists within the protection cluster facilitated building synergies and mutual support across a range of other inclusion-related issues. And then other support mechanisms varied by context. So for example, in Ethiopia, a group of individuals working on other cross-cutting issues such as gender and accountability to affected populations were building a collective supportive environment together. And then in Moldova and Ukraine, the age and disability technical working groups were seen as a primary avenue or mechanism for support for the age inclusion specialists. And as one person in Ethiopia said, as we fight for spaces, we bring along each other. The age inclusion specialist being part of the protection cluster means that we can keep protection and older people on the agenda in the humanitarian country team. And our fourth recommendation was that engaging with key humanitarian stakeholders to socialise the role of the age inclusion specialists and map key entry for engagement should be a preparedness for response priority.
So while recognising the positive contributions to older age inclusion across all the contexts that we looked at, the reality remains that older age continues to be a low priority within the humanitarian system. Diverse and competing needs, donor and organisational funding constraints, a lack of prioritisation compared with other more prominent issues, and the limitations imposed by organisational mandates are all barriers to progressing older age inclusion. The lack of organisations and no dedicated UN agency working directly on older age inclusion was noted in comparison to the number and size of organisations focusing on, for example, women and children. A small number of respondents noted the absence of global guidelines on older age in humanitarian settings as an obstacle. And combined, these barriers limit the ability of the age inclusion specialist to build momentum and capitalise on successes achieved. Respondents recognise more people across all layers of the humanitarian system need to be convinced that older age inclusion warrants attention. So as one respondent said, it's older age that is often left out. Agencies are under so much pressure anyway to deliver with what little they have. With the squeezing of resources, you're squeezing everywhere. So our fifth recommendation is that donors should establish specific indicators for older age inclusion as a conditional requirement for recipients of humanitarian funding. Considering the barriers to furthering older age inclusion, the task of the age inclusion specialist was recognised as large and demanding, and several respondents described the job of convincing humanitarian actors to prioritise older age inclusion in battle-like language, such as a fight, a push, and the age inclusion specialist having their work cut out. Demands on the age inclusion specialist time, the large number of meetings, having to navigate complex systems, and the need to advocate across clusters, organisations and priorities create a daunting workload. In Ethiopia, it was noted it would be extremely difficult for one individual to reach beyond the national humanitarian coordination mechanism to subnational or sub-cluster levels. Because one person can't be able to cover everything, be able to go in every sphere. So our sixth recommendation is that concerted joint advocacy is required to ensure resourcing, including pooled funds for older age inclusion for implementing agencies and across responses.
Unmute, sorry. We've got two key findings around future directions. So the study really clearly showed that important foundations for older age inclusion have been made through the age inclusion specialist role, but there is a clear need for consistent and ongoing advocacy. So our respondents noted that there's a need to move away from more generic and principle-based guidance towards a greater level of nuance, specific and contextualized technical advice and guidance on older age inclusion. In particular, there's been an initial emphasis on data disaggregation of older people as an entry point for advocacy, as Sam mentioned earlier. But respondents in this study really emphasised the need to move on, and suggestions included generating more specific sector evidence, increased attention to the analysis and the use of that data, and then the compilation and dissemination of best practice solutions towards including older people. And this quote, "We have food kits, especially for children, but how can we be sure that this standard kit that we have covers the nutritional needs of older people? We have made adjustments in the kits for Indigenous people because we understand that they don't have the regular diet of a person that lives, for example, in Caracas. But with older people, we don't know anything. What adjustments are necessary in our programmatic activities to address these needs?" So really a call to get more specificity around technical advice. And so our seventh recommendation, advocacy messaging and technical support should be reviewed and refined. There should be a focus on moving from generic and principles-based messaging to tailored and sector-specific technical guidance. And then our final key finding and recommendation. It was widely agreed by respondents that the reality is that little can be progressed in the humanitarian system on older age inclusion without the buy-in of humanitarian leadership. There was also recognition that the impact of the age inclusion specialists can only be advanced through scaling up their presence, whether that's through increased staffing, the establishment of additional age inclusion specialists, or through nominating older age inclusion focal points at cluster or individual agency levels. Some respondents felt that there was a need for the age inclusion specialist position to be elevated beyond the protection cluster, to have a seat in humanitarian leadership, for example, in the intercluster coordination group or the humanitarian country team mechanisms. And there was a specific suggestion to ensure that older age becomes a standing agenda item in meetings of humanitarian leadership, in the same vein as issues like gender, for example. And then at the global level, advocating for the Interagency Standing Committee to develop guidelines or a position statement specifically on older age inclusion in humanitarian response was suggested, or alternatively, integrating older age inclusion into some existing guidelines, such as disability guidelines. And so our final recommendation really sums that up. The intercluster coordination group and humanitarian country teams should ensure representation by the age inclusion specialist or an older age inclusion representative in meetings and dialogues. Recommendations should be made to the Interagency Standing Committee to establish or integrate into existing guidelines specific guidance on older age inclusion in humanitarian action. And that is the end of our brief snapshot. So we'll hand you back to Jane. Thanks very much.
Alex and Rachel, thank you so much for that presentation and sharing your findings and recommendations. And of course, thank you for the important research. And just to say to everyone, the report and all of these findings and recommendations will be made available right after this webinar, so you'll be able to read in more detail. I also wanted to mention that in addition to the age inclusion specialists who were part of this research in Ukraine, Venezuela, Moldova, and Ethiopia, HelpAge also supports age inclusion specialists in 4 other countries that weren't part of this research: Lebanon, South Sudan, Northwest Syria, and Turkey. And before we move to our next speaker, just a reminder to everyone that you can put a question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our panelists will be having a Q&A session after all the speakers have concluded their remarks. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over now to Lemlem Abram, who is the age inclusion specialist working in Ethiopia, who's going to talk about the specifics of her work. Over to you, Lemlem.
Thank you, Jen. Can you open the camera?
Let's see, can you turn on your camera, Lemlem?
Yeah, I was not able to open it. It says I cannot start your video because it's disabled by the host.
Okay, well, while we work on getting your video open.
Okay, shall I start it? Okay.
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As Jen indicated, I work as age inclusion specialist in Ethiopia, and I would like to bring to life some of the findings of the research that were just shared. And as you know, Ethiopia faces a major humanitarian crisis caused by climate shocks, conflict, and insecurity. And in 2024, an estimated 3.3 million Ethiopians were internally displaced, and Ethiopia also hosts the third largest refugee population in Africa. And according to IOM, in 2024, there were also 21 million Ethiopian people who were in need of humanitarian assistance. And the COVID-19 epidemic has taken a serious toll on the country, with older people disproportionately dying from the disease. And when I started, I identified key challenges that were limiting the inclusion and participation of older people in the humanitarian response. And I would like to speak briefly about these three key challenges and the way I have worked with humanitarian actors to improve their knowledge and their programming. The first challenge that I identified was low level of awareness on the rights and specific circumstance of older people, and the absence of key documents that can guide the humanitarian response. However, through the training, I provide training for almost more than 300 humanitarian actors on inclusive humanitarian action. And I also reviewed and revised key national documents such as cluster strategies, targeting guideline, and documents such as humanitarian need overview and the humanitarian response plan for Ethiopia, which is a guiding document for all humanitarian works that is done here. And with the support I was providing, Shelter Cluster also developed a guideline on age and disability, inclusive age and disability, inclusive shelter and NFI responses. I also work with donors so that now the Ethiopian Humanitarian Fund, the centralized pool of funding, include requirements for the inclusion of older people in the projects that the fund supports. And the second challenge that I identified was the significant lack of data on older people. And as you know, without data, it's very difficult to to develop program effectively and efficiently. And it also reinforced the invisibility of older people in the system. So to change this, I was advocating for the collection and disaggregation of data based on age, gender, and disability, and also the disaggregation of age above the age of 60. I also work with various humanitarian stakeholders to revise the major data collection tools they were using. And as a result, the visibility of older people in data significantly improved. For instance, while the previous assessment report older people as comprising less than 4% of the affected population, recent data in one zone of the Tigray region revealed that 26% of the households are headed by older individuals. That's more than 25% of households headed by older people. The third challenge that I identified was the absence of older people as participants in the humanitarian response mechanism. And as you may know, Ethiopia has more than 1,500 organizations of older people, or what we call older people association. But until recently, they haven't been engaged in humanitarian process. And the participation of older people is crucial part of effective and accountable humanitarian response. They are the one who knows the best their situation and many of the solutions. So to advance their participation, I have been providing training for older people about their right and how to participate in the humanitarian program. We also provided technical and financial support for 2 older people associations so that they can participate regularly in the coordination meeting to share their insight and influence the direction of the work. Now, because of the output indicator we developed, the clusters are trying to include older people association in their activities, which is really an important step. One of older person association leader told me about his experience, saying, HelpAge has supported us since the very beginning of our foundation. Due to the conflict, we have faced numerous challenges. Our office were looted, our equipments destroyed, and we were left without the means to participate in humanitarian activities. As a result, we were excluded. The needs of older people were often overlooked. Thanks to the support we are now receiving, I have been able to participate, raise my voice, and represent not only myself, but also other older persons through my organization. From what I have heard from older people and what I have seen myself, participation of older people in all part of the humanitarian response are crucial, and we're going to continue to advocate this work. Thank you, and I'm passing back over to Jen.
Lem, thank you so much for sharing that. It was great to hear about some of the specifics of the work that you do as an age inclusion specialist, and to also really hear about how important the participation of older people is in ensuring that the response is effective and efficient. And it's great to learn about the work that you've been doing to support that. And we know it's true of age inclusion specialists working in other areas as well. So really kind of bridging all aspects of the humanitarian response down to those who know the very best what their communities need. So now we'll hear from our last speaker, last but not least at all, is Kasia Kotmayevska, who is the Senior Protection Coordinator for UNHCR in Ukraine. And over to you, Kasia. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Jane, and such a pleasure to be here today and be able to explain how wonderful collaboration we have with our age inclusion expert. I will start a little bit with a very brief overview of the context, because actually in Ukraine, older people are a very significant vulnerable group among affected populations. It is 30%. As stipulated in the humanitarian needs and response plans. And then there is a number of strategic priorities for the humanitarian country team that address the needs of older people very specifically. That is, for example, in Ukraine, we're working a lot on evacuations, and because of the limited low mobility of older people, they require specialized services during evacuation, specialized communication during evacuation, specialized vehicles during evacuations. So all of that all of that comes into play when we discuss evacuations for this vulnerable group. And for example, together with our expert, we were advocating an under centrality of protection presentation in the humanitarian country team. This is very new, and I didn't mention it before. On 26th of June, we will be advocating with the humanitarian coordinator on a number of measures to enable better, safer evacuation of older people and people with disabilities from frontline areas, so they can be in safety. We also work a lot on social services. That is more of the protection cluster's nexus work, when we engage with the Ministry of Social Policy here and see how we can have, like, on one hand, build the capacity of departments of social policy, but on the other hand, also have complementary humanitarian services to the existing social services here around home-based care, assisted living, social accompaniment, how these services can be strengthened within Ukrainian context. And also, I mean, finally, I came a tiny bit late to the panel because we had an air alert, and this just made me think, as an older person, of course, I would face much larger challenges. So also, whenever we work on protection side in response to attacks that are really a daily basis, and April has been the deadliest month since September last year in Ukraine, particularly in these frontline areas. Of course, people of older age require specialized responses and a bit more attention from the community-based organizations who provide this support. So that's where it also comes very handy to have age inclusion experts advise for them. Now, a few examples how we more specifically work with our age inclusion expert, Natalia. So Natalia works hand in hand with a colleague, Julia, and they both, for the protection cluster, coordinate the age and disability technical working group. which is a super well attended forum by protection partners. But this group, although hosted within the protection cluster, really serves the wider humanitarian community. So we do have partners from other clusters also coming in to benefit from this expertise, technical expertise on age and disability inclusion. And also, this is a forum that really enhances localization of the response, because this is where, in addition to international humanitarian actors, we have national partners, the National Association of People with Disabilities coming in, Organization of People with Disabilities, as well as older people associations. And for example, through advocacy of this technical working group, we managed to ensure that OPAs are also included among the organizations that were benefiting from the community-based protection window under Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund, with a dedicated fund that for community-based protection activities this year. Natalia, our age experts, is very involved in capacity building of protection partners and way beyond. I mean, really humanitarian actors. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a wonderful training in Dnipro, so not specifically in Kiev, but we really, Natalia goes out to the deeper field locations. The interest was so high that we had to add an extra day to make sure that partners can really participate, and we already have further responses on, for example, on specifically on Washington group questions for Natalia to facilitate. And that's where we also know that partners particularly value this expertise that is brought in. On a more operational level, for example, in the context of evacuations in Ukraine, what is a very specific risk that many of the older people are facing is, this kind of automatic assumptions of many actors who conduct evacuations to place these people automatically in geriatric facilities, in institutions, and that of course is a high risk. There is even there are statistics by the Ministry of Social Policy of how many older people were placed in institutions in the context of evacuations, whereby not always is this necessary, and of course goes contrary to Ukraine's ambitions to deinstitutionalize. So we have conducted, it was Natalia, our age inclusion expert, who has been conducting sessions in the National Protection Cluster meeting, where we have over 200 partners participating to raise awareness about the need to conduct individual assessments that can determine whether an older person can stay within its support networks rather than be automatically placed in the institutions. And we're really trying to work on shift on this mindset to prevent the institutionalization. Furthermore, a few more quick examples of our age inclusion expert who works very much so with other clusters. For example, with Shelter Wash cluster on the winter planning, with the energy working group that we have here. You may know that in Ukraine, energy infrastructure has been quite affected by the airstrikes, and we know that older people are particularly at risk, and particularly those who are disconnected from their social networks. So through Natalia, we were able to bring in, this people-centered thinking, not just focused strictly on infrastructure, but having the older people and the specific special tailored responses they require also incorporated in that work. Very recently, for example, that's a new thing. CCCM cluster also reached out to us to ask for age inclusion advice on refurbishment of collective sites. So this support requests come to us very often, and our age inclusion expert is addressing them very, very efficiently. Age and Disability Technical Working Group also sits in the ICCG, and through that has access to advocate at the HCT level. And finally, Age and Disability Technical Working Group, or Natalia, works very closely with other cross-cutting functions. She has been working with the AAP advisor on developing the specific guidelines on AAP concerning older people and how to communicate with older people, how to include older people meaningfully in humanitarian responses, but also with LGBTIQ plus populations or community-based organizations, as well as gender advisor. That is important part of work, and maybe that is my last reflection. Of course, you will have heard a lot about this ongoing humanitarian reset, where we are all supposed to show, efficiencies and how we work together. So I think our age inclusion expert is really providing a lot of very good practices in terms of how to while I think it is, challenge going forward, because from protection perspective, I believe it's super important that we maintain these nuances around having separate vulnerable groups that will have very, very diverse sets of risks. And the concern is, of course, that as humanitarian funding will be shrinking, this may be all mingling together, which I think we should definitely avoid. However, showing that age experts, disability experts, gender experts, AAP experts can come in together and build on this, exacerbating vulnerabilities and showing intersectionalities, common patterns, is a good way forward. That in our operation, our age expert has been particularly good at. So I'll just finish with thanking a lot HelpAge for offering us this fantastic resource. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kasia, for your support, your interest in collaborating with the age inclusion specialist, and for highlighting these different contributions, as well as the really important point of intersectionality, of how all older people have multiple different identities that also may increase their risk, and also many of the commonalities for some of these very high risk groups. And now that with the changes, transformation, and constraints we see in the humanitarian system, how important it is that their both contributions and their needs and rights are really taken into the front of consideration. So a huge thank you to all of our speakers for your really compelling presentations. And we'd like to just now go over to some of the questions. Some of them are being answered in writing, but I thought we could also take a few for discussion. So, one that came up and I think would be worth really hearing from some of our panelists on is, what is the value and societal benefits of including older people in humanitarian programming? So as participants in the different systems that exist, kind of why is that important? And I was wondering if Lemlem, since you are working directly with some older persons associations in Ethiopia, if you wanted to just say quickly a few words about why you think, or what value do you see for them, speaking and being active in the planning and programming. Thanks. Oh, you're muted, Lemlem.
Okay, I think it's very important to ensure the inclusion of older people in planning and in the implementation of the program, because we can ensure the inclusion of older people and include specific activities that can address the specific needs of older people. Without planning, I don't think we can respond. So I think it's very important. This is what I can say.
Great. Kasia, anything that you've seen from your side, kind of in the practical implementation and having older people's voices right in the mix?
I mean, I am reflecting. I think it goes very much, into the when I was setting the scene for the context analysis a little bit and trying to show how basically some of the big strategic priorities that we are dealing with in Ukraine response are you know, issues that affect older people per se. So, you know, we could not possibly work on evacuations now, because most of the people who are staying in the front lines are really really older people right now. So we couldn't tackle this issue without having heard and understanding what the specific needs of the older people are, but also coming with the understanding that they do have their own agency. And, you know, evacuation is not the only modality for them. For many of older people who have spent, you know, the whole day, the whole lives in their house, they would prefer to stay there despite all the risks. And then we need to adapt our response and find ways to support them with specialized services where they are as well. So yeah, just an example to share.
Great, thank you so much. So we had some other questions. Another one was, you know, do you have any insight in how to overcome, you know, some of the barriers or resistance among humanitarian actors to collection of and use of disaggregated data? We know that disaggregated data can be very important in knowing how to target resources, but sometimes that meets some resistance. Alex or Rachel, I don't know if this came up in your research, if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, I'll hand over to Rachel in a second, because I think this certainly came up in so when we were doing the research, we divided the countries. I was looking at Ukraine and Moldova, and Rachel was looking at Ethiopia and Venezuela. Definitely the age inclusion specialists across all the countries are putting a lot of work into and really advocating for the disaggregation of data, and specifically into not just people over 60 or 65, but by 10-year age brackets as well. So I think there's definitely progress being made there, but Rachel, you might want to speak to this, because I think there's also now a desire to kind of move beyond that. So Rachel, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Alex. I've just popped an answer in the chat actually to Dr. J's question around that. Yes, it definitely came up. It was particularly in the key finding number 6, I think, number 7, sorry, and recommendation 7, that the vast majority of respondents had heard the data disaggregation message that had come through loud and clear. It didn't necessarily mean it was always happening in practice, but the message was being heard. And people felt that the next step and the way to really put that into practice and get people actually practically applying data disaggregation was to give meaning around it. So to start to understand how to interpret that data, how to analyze that data, and how to give it contextual meaning and relevance as to what that might mean for program implementation. So I think the idea of generic training and advocacy around older age data disaggregation now needs to be accompanied by some really clear guidance on how to interpret it, how to understand it, and how to actually use it. So that was probably the clearest message that came out.
And I think just to add to that is that when we're talking about data, we're talking about a really broad spectrum of different types of information. So it's not only simply that disaggregation, it's really understanding more about needs, about how that informs interventions as well. So I think also, just to add to what Rachel said, that broader consideration of what data means and what data is useful for your work and for your programs.
Fantastic, thank you. Any last thoughts from any of our speakers? Getting to the top of the hour here. All right. Well, I just
Jane, sorry, I will add
Yes,
on data, because I think there is also there is a lot of focus on the disaggregation, and I cannot underestimate how important it is. Where I sometimes feel we don't do enough in humanitarian operations is that we do not look more at the data sets from people's perspective and what the actual needs of people are. So not only at figures, not only at numbers, but actually understanding what the needs of the older people are, and what the different risks, where do they face this risk, and how does this translate specifically to the programming. So I always like to make this point that yes, we have to push, and I think in Ukraine response, we've had a lack of being until now quite well resourced. So many things are in place that we have to struggle for in other operations. But let's not be blinded by figures only, because behind the figures stand people, and that's what we should remember even more.
Such an important point. Thank you so much. And Sam?
Yeah, just wanted to say a final thing, just to really recognise the huge achievements of our age inclusion specialists. I mean, this really is an initiative that started in its infancy just about 3 years ago, and has grown quite rapidly. We were very much the new kids on the block and sort of seen as, what are you doing here? And you guys have done an incredible job getting established, and this is becoming a key part of humanitarian responses and of the coordination system. There's bumps in the road. It's challenging, but doing an incredible job. And I think we need to celebrate the journey where we've come from, and of course also looking forward to where we're going to as well. But well done, everyone.
Thank you so much to everyone for your remarks and all of your insights. Thank you to all of our participants. Thank you for joining us. And everyone who registered for this event today will receive a link to the report, and as well as a copy of this recording for future reference and for sharing widely. And with that, I'd like to close the webinar. Thank you again.